Greetings, fellow artists. My name is David Yehuda, and I am going to paint a tree today using sponges. First, I am mixing the background sky using ultramarine blue and phthalo blue, green shade, and white. I use a spatula to mix these colors together, and then I apply the colors with a sponge brush. I use a regular brush a little bit, but not so much. I have already prepped the canvas. It's a 24 by 24 inch canvas, and I used gold paint, basic gold paint, which is a thin paint, and then I applied on top of that texture modeling paste and just where the leaves are going to be. So I've already planned out, I've laid out the basics of what's going to go where, even though I'm going to paint over this basic scheme. I also drew in the trunk of the tree as well as the branches, just to give me an idea of where they are. I used white chalk for this, and the white chalk can be painted over as well as it can also be erased after the painting is done. I usually varnish my paintings, and I would recommend that if there is any white chalk from your planning phase after the painting is done, that you wipe off the white chalk so that it will not show up exactly where it was. The blue sky in my painting was barely referenced in the reference photo, and I will show the reference photo in a few minutes. The photo is very simply a basic Japanese maple tree taken in the Japanese gardens of Portland, Oregon. It was taken in the fall, so it's red and the leaves do turn color. Also, the next phase of this painting, after I finish the blue, and it's a sky blue, if you'll notice, I'm painting across. I'm going crosswise. I usually do that on sky if it's going to be a clear blue sky without a lot of clouds. There are some other schemes that you can paint blue sky by, including cross hatching and then painting the clouds on top of that. But any clouds that appear in this painting are just incidental. I'm not concentrating on painting any clouds. As you can tell, the first top third of the painting was painted blue. The next third of the painting is going to be a base coat of green, and I highly recommend that you mix your greens. In this case, I used ultramarine blue and cad yellow medium. Oftentimes, when I set up a green background like this, I will add some phthalo green, and also if I'm going to have a lighter green, I could mix in a light lime green. Incidentally, I use as much as possible golden heavy body paints. Um, I use those interchangeably with Liquitex heavy body paints. I use these heavy body paints almost exclusively, even when I do a watercolor type painting. I still do acrylics, all of it's acrylics, and I try to do these acrylics as much as I can. Sometimes I try to emulate watercolors using Golden's absorbent ground, and I'll show that in another video about how you can apply the absorbent ground. The next layer that I am adding is the bottom most layer of this painting, and it is the ground that the trunk of the tree is extended into. I'm not showing this right now, but I will show it in a bit. Next phase of the painting, as you can tell again, the top third of the painting is blue, and the middle, it looks to be about half of the painting, is green, and then the bottom where the ground is going to be, I've painted red. I used the sponge brush to brush on the base coat, but right now I'm using a sea sponge, which is available at Michael's or Blick. These sea sponges are very cheap. They're usually sold in packages, and they're used to give texture to just about anything that they're applied to. In this case, I've applied burnt umber and raw umber to the sponge, and I'm dabbing it on just on the bottom of the painting where the red is. As you can tell, off to my shoulder there is the reference photo. You can see a little bit more when I bend close to the picture. There is the red tree with the dark trunk and the green background. Up in the sky, you can tell it is blue with very little clouds. The next thing that I'm doing here is I'm adding some variation in the green. It's usually a best idea if you're going to be painting one color on top of another one, to make sure that the bottom color has dried enough before you add a contrasting color. Otherwise, you would get a blending of the colors, and if you're not intending to blend the colors on the canvas, then you either wait or dry the background of the painting off with a blow dryer, which I do use, but I did not use in this case because I waited long enough so that the green would dry, and I'm adding yellow on top of this. Another thing to avoid and watch out for is what's called patterning, and that is basically when you're laying down color with a sponge, as I'm doing, or with a brush or anything else. Avoid making a pattern, an unintended pattern. You would want to instead have a random color scheme and not just have patterns unless you intend for there to be patterns. Adding more color to the background green. In this case, I did not completely avoid patterns. The background of the tree in this case was bushes. However, the way I laid down this pattern, it kind of looks like rows of corn almost, but in the reference photo there were no rows of anything except for bushes. As you will see in the final result of this painting, the green background, it will be obscured mostly by the tree, which has this very heavy, large, dense leaf pattern. It's almost like a halo in this square painting. What I'm trying to do, what I will be doing, is contrasting the green with the red leaves that are going to be in the tree, and of course I need to make sure that the green is completely dry before I attempt to paint the red leaves, because if the red and the green mix together unintentionally, you end up with a brown color or even a black color. And again, if that's what you intend, that looks fine, but in this case that's not what I intend. I intend for the red to stick out, and then I will have some yellow and orange highlights. What I'm doing now in the painting is I'm adding this light lime green color. In the reference photo there is a row of hedges that are light lime green, and I'm adding this particular row of color basically because it's in the reference photo, and I'm trying to match the reference photo as best I can. I don't always necessarily do this. With the reference photo, you can stick to the reference photo or you can deviate from it. It's basically up to you what your own creative urges lead you to do. Now I'm adding with another sponge the burnt umber and the raw umber to give just a bit of a speckled pattern to this row, this light row of lime green. The next phase of the painting is going to be chalking in the tree. As you can see, the original outline is no longer visible, so I will be chalking in the tree using the pastel white. I also often use yellow if I'm painting on a white background, and if I'm painting on a white background, then I use the yellow. I used to use black charcoal, but I found that the black smudges and it leaves a unintended gray outline to objects, so I stopped using the gray for that purpose. When drawing a tree, be careful not to make your tree too cartoony. And cartoony is basically the way a 4-year-old or a 7-year-old would draw a tree. What I'm doing here is I'm drawing each segment, each branch, one segment at a time, and then each branch is set at an angle from the other branches. This just happens to be particular about this Japanese maple, is all of the twists and contortions that the branches grow in. This might be intentional from the Japanese gardeners who wanted, in my opinion, the tree to look as contorted as possible. So once again, I'm following the reference picture as close as I can for the general broad strokes of the lower trunk, and then later when I start adding minor branches, then it's basically random where the branches will go. As you can see, the branches twist. They extend for about an inch or so, and then there's anywhere from a 10 to 70-degree angle that the new branch emulates from. One thing that I try to be careful of when drawing trees and branches is to make them not too thick. I still want to see the background blue color in the backs of these trees. And this particular Japanese maple was cut so that many of its appendages should emulate animals like giraffes or geese or certain animals like that. Just let your imagination wander when looking at the reference picture or looking at the final picture. As you can see, the trunk grows about an inch into the red background. The red background is meant to be fallen leaves mixed with elements of ground. I have drawn this particular Japanese elm several times before in different angles. The original Japanese elm in the garden, in the Japanese gardens in Portland, Oregon, is located next to the water. You don't necessarily need to draw water as a background, but I have drawn this particular tree in a multitude of settings. This particular setting is the tree in perhaps a background of a forest or perhaps a field that has been cultivated. The color of the branches in this particular painting, when I add the color of the expanse of the branches, it will probably use a combination of earth colors, including burnt umber, raw umber, yellow oxide, red oxide, carbon black, Payne's gray, and even Hooker's green, which is a gray-green color. And now I'm mixing together black with the dark red, and this is only my personal choice as to paint from the bottom of the trunk and the bottom of the branches going upward. I've seen other artists paint quite in the opposite direction, starting with the most extreme branches and then painting downward. But I want to match the growth of the trees, the way they twist and contort, much like this particular branch does. Remember that branches and the trunk of the tree are always thickest at the bottom, and then it tapers off. This is a skill that you will soon develop if you keep at it, painting these kinds of trees. I started off painting willow trees and then olive trees. Mostly I paint tropical trees. This Japanese elm is probably one of the newer species of trees that I've attempted, but it's not the only species that I paint. Other tree species include the weeping willow, regular maples, oaks, especially famous oaks like Liberty oaks. The branches continue to stretch out. However, they are not touching each other at the ends. There is a unseen arc of the tree branches. It can definitely be seen up close. The tree branches reach into this arc that is the branches and the leaves of the tree. The center of the tree, however, will not be covered in branches like a child's drawing would be. There are several different ways of painting the trunk of a tree. One of my favorites is to use a palette knife, but I did not use a palette knife in this particular example. However, I am using CAD red medium to highlight the branches. Another idea is to paint moss on the tree, but we did not do that this time. The branches are painted, then the leaves are painted, and then the branches are painted once again because the leaves will cover up some of the branches. But in this impressionistic slash expressionistic painting, I wish the leaves to stand out. Once again, the ground has a pattern, and the pattern is to have completely random marks. I used red, a very wide variety of reds for the outer leaves. These reds include cad red medium, red oxide, magenta, and some other varieties of red. I will highlight the leaves using other colors as the red dries, including pink, patches of pink, and also avoid any kind of pattern when applying the sponge paint. Try to become as random as possible, even twisting the sponge around a little bit so that it does not create a pattern. Now this arch that I was telling you about, the arch of the leaves, is apparent. Again, the leaves are added in stages. You will notice that the background remains visible through the trees, branches. Because I waited for the green to dry before adding the reds and the greens are remaining separate from each other. They're not blending. However, the branches are a little bit wet, so when I'm dabbing the red on, it is mixing a little bit, but I will be highlighting, going over those branches that are getting paint on them. I will be going over them with a dark color, and I will be using a brush that is angled. Some people call it a dagger brush. I call it an angle brush, and this will be used to paint over the branches once again so that they stick out. As paint on the palette gets used up, you can add more paint. The palette that I am using here is paper plates, Chinette paper plates specifically. I prefer them because of their sturdiness. Be careful not to buy cheap dollar store plates. This is something that is very important in that the plates are able to maintain their shape so that I can use them as palette knives, pallets, and just throw them away when you're done with them. This is essential that you use a fresh plate for each new project. Once again, those reds that I used included naphthol crimson, and quinacridone magenta, in addition to the CAD red medium. I do add a little bit later on, in addition to these colors that are on the palette, I do add an orange variety. This is CAD orange medium. I'm going over the branches to darken them once again so that they stick out in the painting. All that needs to occur now is thickening of the leaves. I apply several coats and paint the tiniest of the branches last so that the darkness of the branches are highlighted. This is not always the effect that is desired. However, with this particular species of tree, this is the effect that I'm trying to create, and that is this kind of articulating arterial structure of the branches and the tree. Usually I like to paint trees and scenes in autumn, especially those variety of trees that change colors and are not evergreens. The evergreens I often paint year-round. The evergreens can be quite beautiful when they're painted in the snow with snow covering. That's a different project altogether. If you'll notice, at this stage, the branches still have the white chalk. After the complete painting has dried, I do wipe the chalk off. I use a dry face cloth or washcloth to take the white chalk off. It's actually pastel, but you don't have to necessarily use a dry washcloth in order to accomplish this. Some people do use a wet washcloth. I try not to use paper towel, however, when doing this particular feat, because the paper towel or tissue would tend to come apart in some of the impasto features of the tree, and that would definitely be a undesired effect. And as you can see, the final version of the tree has purple, yellow, and orange